we start with the future of monetary policy in the U.S. as central bankers head back to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, with a new framework on the agenda. Our special contributor Larry Summers takes us through what he'd like to see.
I'm not sure that it's the right time for a big new framework when you have an outgoing chairman. I would have thought that a new chairman should be providing a new framework when the new chairman arrives after the new chairman has consulted. So this seems a rather odd timing for a major new framework announcement. It seems to me that, if anything, the errors have been on the side of excessive transparency, excessive forecasting, excessive what we used to call, when I was in government, iatrogenic volatility. Iatrogenic illness is when you get sick from being in a hospital. Iatrogenic volatility is when officials' comments end up adding instability to markets. So I think at the moment we have too many dot plots, too many forecasts, too much cacophony, and some of the ideas for more information from the Fed, I think, will end up pushing markets around without any great benefit. My own view is that Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan had this right. They saw the Fed chairman as like the Delphi oracles were thousands of years ago. They were imperfect and couldn't really know the future, but people thought they were omniscient and omnipotent, and it was therefore better to keep any statements vague and oracular. Certainly the dominant theme the last time the Fed had a new framework review was the difficulty of getting inflation up to target. That's not our problem anymore. Our problem now is making sure that high inflation expectations don't become embedded. So corrections back towards symmetry with respect to inflation seem to me to be appropriate. And I think one should learn from the fact that, with the best of intentions, the framework adopted before, right ahead of the pandemic, wasn't really the right framework as things turned out, and that could happen again. So I think the Fed would do well to avoid being overly prescriptive at this juncture. Finally, I think that the whole question of the management of the maturity structure of the federal debt needs careful consideration. What matters to markets is the debt that they have to absorb. And the spectacle we've seen at a number of times in recent junctures where the Treasury was trying to push the maturity structure of the debt in one direction and the Fed was trying to push the maturity structure of the debt in the other direction seems odd.
Larry, this week we got CPI numbers in, which basically I took two messages away from. One is we are persistently above that 2% mark on inflation, and it seems to be really stubbornly so. And yet the markets took it as, boy, it's sure the Fed's going to cut in September. The likelihood went to almost 100%. Can you square those two things?
I think that there's also evidence of weakening in the economy, and it's that weakening that I think is behind the market's view that the Fed will likely ease rates. I think that while inflation was elevated, it was not as elevated as many feared that it would be. So I wouldn't want to fight hard against the market's judgment with respect to September. I think it's also probably worth remembering, David, that what you described as a certainty of a 25 basis point cut in September is probably better understood as a likelihood of a 25 basis point cut, with 50 basis points and 0 being about equally likely, so the whole thing averages out to a 25 basis point cut, and there's more data to come in. And so I think it would be a mistake to be certain for anybody about what would happen. We could get very, very weak data that push towards a 50 basis point cut. We could get information on inflation and the strength of the economy that push towards delaying cuts even further. So it's a mistake to be certain about what's going to happen.
One of the sources weighing on the 50 basis point cut side has been the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, who said that might make sense in September.
We should probably be 150, 175 basis points lower. So, I think the committee needs to step back. I think probably one of the most politicized governors just went off the board.
I was surprised to see the secretary, any secretary of the Treasury, be that prescriptive. Usually that kind of judgment is not made by administration officials, and I'm not sure it's helpful for the administration to be publicly prescribing on monetary policy. Beyond that, I don't think the statement is in line with what I would say. I would have said that any model of monetary policy has to be based on a judgment about what the neutral interest rate is, and has to be based on a judgment about inflation expectations. If one has the view that substantially elevated deficit spending plus substantially elevated data center spending is greatly, plus reduced trade deficits in the United States, plus higher asset prices, which reduce the flow of funds for saving. If one has the view that all of that is raising the net demand for funds, then I think one might think that neutral interest rates have risen quite substantially, in which case you wouldn't be prescribing 175 basis point cut in rates unless we see a recession. I think the possibility and the risk of inflation expectations starting to pick up, given big budget deficits, given tariff pressures, given political uncertainties surrounding the Fed, is also a reason why one wouldn't want to feel that we were committed to major rate reduction going forward. So I'm not here to tell you that that's not going to happen. I'm not here to tell you that it shouldn't happen. I can certainly imagine circumstances in which the economy could play out in which those kinds of cuts would be appropriate. But it seems to me to be confidently prescribing them at this juncture is beyond what I would see as a prudent judgment, all the more when the judgment is being made by a senior official with responsibility for policy.
We end the week with President Trump meeting with President Putin in Alaska to talk about Ukraine, with Ukraine not being present. And I wonder what your thoughts are on what effects that have economically. And let me ask you specifically about those Russian assets that you've talked about on this program more than once.
David, President Trump, like him or not like him, support what he does or be more skeptical of some of the things he does, is the most transactional of all presidents. I would have thought and hoped that a president who was so transactional, with the tremendous leverage over Russia that's represented by the fact that we have currently frozen their reserves, would use our claim on those reserves as leverage to drive them to a just peace with Ukraine. I know there's some reluctance about that in Europe. There's concern that it might inhibit some countries' ability to sell debt. President Trump's errors in the past have not been over solicitude for European views. So I have been surprised and a bit disappointed that President Trump has not been prepared to bring the reserves issue more into the foreground, because I think it would be helpful to him in achieving his objectives of putting the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the rearview mirror.